Good afternoon, good afternoon. I'm sure some of you out there can hear me. If you're joining us on Twitter, on Facebook, welcome, welcome. It's a Sunday, another one of those wonderful good Sundays, and today is the last of the four-part UCT GESDA series titled Using the Science of the Future to Shape Your Present. This series that we've been busy with, and this is the last of the four parts of the series. Its aim is to bridge our understanding of how science might shape our future, how we can use these predicted futures to shape the present, and how do we ensure that decisions and discussions include the voices of the African youth. We don't want to get into the future without the voices of the African youth being included. But why is it critical to include the voices of Africa and Africa's youth in particular in shaping the science of the future? Well, it's important because they can start working now to mitigate both emerging and long-standing inequalities. Only by bringing diverse voices and ideas to the discussion, we can ensure that we get the best thinking from every part of our society and corner of the world. And that's important. If we don't bring the diverse voices, we only hear one side, only one noise, one voice. And that's not enough to make sure that we hear everyone and the future caters for all. We need the fresh perspectives of African youth in these dialogues and debates. It is a matter of intergenerational justice because they will inherit the future. And so they must be involved in shaping how science should be used to affect it. The partnership between GESDA and UCT to create the Youth Anticipation Initiative through these critical and thought-provoking conversations is part of UCT's vision to ensure that we are a future-oriented university that creates leaders who tackle social injustices. African universities play a critical role in training and upskilling future leaders to be bilingual in both science and diplomacy for addressing global challenges. GESDA is a Geneva-based think and do tank, and its mission is to anticipate, accelerate, and translate into concrete actions the use of emerging science-driven topics, using, among other tools, the GESDA Science Breakthrough Radar. They aim to anticipate scientific breakthroughs and to ensure that we use the predicted advances to improve well-being and promote inclusive development. And today, we focus on science and diplomacy. Science and diplomacy is a relatively new concept that has gained traction in the last 10 years on the global agenda. But let's unpack this term, as many in our audience might be unfamiliar with it. These two words, science and diplomacy, didn't usually go together, but as more of our challenges cross borders, have scientific dimensions, we have an urgent need to bridge the gap between the scientific and diplomatic communities to address shared issues. Science diplomacy has got three dimensions: science for diplomacy, science in diplomacy, and diplomacy for science. Science for diplomacy is when science as a common language to bridge political differences and improve international relations. So if you talk about science and diplomacy, that's when we're talking about science as a language to bridge the political differences between different nations and to improve international relations. And science in diplomacy is when we use scientific evidence to inform foreign policy and diplomatic processes. For example, climate negotiations or transboundary issues like air pollution and dealing with a global pandemic. And diplomacy for science is when we use diplomatic channels to support international scientific collaboration. For example, to establish large research infrastructure such as the SKA radio telescopes in Southern Africa and Australia. That's when we do diplomacy for science. So diplomacy can serve science, and that we have seen in our world. But of course, science can also serve diplomacy, and they work together in that way. But today, Science diplomacy is facing a new challenge to adapt to the speed of scientific progress, the shifts in international relations and geopolitical dynamics, and the need to contextualize and adapt these frameworks to develop world regions such as Africa. Of course, we have the competition today. Before I introduce my two experts who are going to unpack this for us and tell us how can we use science and diplomacy to inform, to shape our today. We have a competition. If you go to the UCT Twitter page at UCT_news, you'll get the details of the competition. We have a lot of people already who have submitted the intention to participate in the competition, and we are sending them information. We will be sending them information on the competition so that they can send their entries. If you haven't seen that, go to the UCT Facebook page and UCT Twitter page and look for those details and then participate. These sessions, of course, are meant to get our young people to participate. So if you are 30 years or younger, to participate in that competition, you have to be 30 years or younger. So do that and participate in that way. If you do that and you win, you will get an all expenses paid trip to attend the GESDA Summit 2022, a global summit of thought leaders on these topics that we've been talking about every Sunday, and it will take place in Geneva, Switzerland from the 12th to the 14th of October, 2022. The summit will bring together academics, politicians, diplomats, executives, and investors from around the world to participate in a series of plenary and parallel sessions of rich and engaged discussions. That's what's in store for you. You can make comments as we go along. I'm inviting, if you're on Twitter, on Facebook, put comments and use the hashtags, #Youth in Science, #Science for Africa, and tag at UCT News, UCT_news if you're on Twitter, and GESDA at GESDA Global if you're on Twitter. If you're Facebook, it's just University of Cape Town. Then, from now on, we're going to watch two videos, but as I said to you, I've got two speakers, Dan Dutoy and Professor Tulula Oni, and you will meet them after the two videos. I'm going to invite you to sit back and look at the two videos. They are separate videos. The first one will take about 2 minutes, 7 seconds, and it focuses on science-based diplomacy. The second one will take about 2 minutes, 18 seconds, and it focuses on collaborative science diplomacy. Sit back, listen carefully, and we'll unpack more of the issues that come out of those videos together with Tolu and Dan. See you just now. Let me welcome our two colleagues, Mr. Dan du Toit. You both have made outstanding contributions with Professor Tolula Oni to advancing science diplomacy in Africa across different sectors, in academia, in government, and the multilateral system, and contextualizing its theory and practice in African context. And so I'm so delighted to have an opportunity to have a conversation with both of you today. So thank you so much for making the time. Dan, I want to start with you just to tell people about your career so that they know why I'm asking you these questions that I'm asking you. Dan du Toit started his career in the South African government, where he trained as a diplomat. Since 2002, he has been attached to the Department of Science and Technology, which is now the Department of Science and Innovation, where he notably served as the department's representative in Europe, based in Brussels. In 2014, he was appointed as Deputy Director General for the Portfolio International Cooperation and Resources. Over the years, Dan had the privilege to contribute to multiple initiatives in support of a diverse and rich international partnership portfolio for South African science, technology, and innovation. He played a central role in the establishment and management of the European South African Science and Technology Advancement Program, with the mission to support South African participation in the European Union's framework programs. Dan has represented South Africa in diverse multilateral forums, such as the OECD's Global Science Forum, the Group on Earth Observations, and the BRICS partnerships, as well as in various structures related to African regional and continental cooperation of the African Union and the South African Development Community. Another current flagship activity he's intimately involved in is South Africa's hosting of an affiliate center of the World Economic Forum Center for the Fourth Industrial Revolution. Dan, I'd like you to introduce your views on science and diplomacy and why a country such as us needs it. Give us a perspective and share a little bit about your work and your trajectory in science and diplomacy. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Prof, and thank you for this opportunity to you, to UCT and GESDA. Certainly, science diplomacy is a topic I'm not only passionate about, but one I've had a huge privilege to serve South Africa as a public servant over many years. And indeed, science diplomacy is a priority. It's a priority for the South African government, but we would like to believe for all of South Africa. We are currently in the midst of finalizing a new 10-year plan, a decadal plan for science, technology and innovation in South Africa. And what I should say in the first instance, it's not a plan for us in government, it's not a plan for the bureaucrats, it's a plan for all South Africans. And why I mention that is that science diplomacy is one of the key strategic priorities for that decadal plan. And to tell our participants a little bit more, what does it mean in practice? What does science diplomacy mean for us in the Department of Science and Innovation? And Prof, you set the scene by referring to the three definitions we spoke about. And let me start by perhaps the one closest to sort of ground level, and that is, how do we use diplomacy to advance science? Now, right from the onset, when our department was created in the early years of our democracy, we lived by the motto that science knows no borders. And we knew that throughout the ages, science has always progressed if one works together across borders. If there's a sharing of experience, a sharing of expertise, joint investments. So our mission is in the first instance to ensure that South Africa is connected to global science so we can benefit from collaboration. And I think UCT, with its extensive network of global partnerships, is an excellent example. But we also believe that investment, and it's about anticipating the future, investment in the next generation of scientists. We need to afford opportunities for our next generation of scientists to train abroad, to have exchange visits abroad. So we focus on negotiating and then implementing a whole range of international partnerships programs which support South African science. So this could involve the likes of co-funding of research with international partners. Some of our Researchers in the audience may be well familiar with the programs implemented through our National Research Foundation, where it would be co-funded projects with international partners, participation in international programs, currently such as the Horizon Europe, or indeed mobility programs. The Erasmus program would, for example, be well familiar to the participants. But Prof, you also mentioned in one of your examples, research infrastructure, typically large-scale research infrastructures. They're too expensive. They're too complicated, often for one country to have them in their own. So whether it is negotiating agreements for South Africa to host facilities such as the SKA telescope, or negotiate access to beam time at, for example, CERN or the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility, access to data sets, this is all part of how we use diplomacy for the benefit for science, but also very important, the governance of science. When we speak about open access, open data, ethics and integrity, this often involves rule setting debated in global forums, and it's also our role to represent South Africa in those discussions. And again, just to emphasize the point you made, Prof, for us, it's very important that Africa has a voice. Global is a science is a global enterprise, and that must be an inclusive enterprise. But then perhaps to go to the second dimension, and when we look at science in diplomacy, and you've mentioned the examples, COVID-19, climate change, energy security, food security, all the critical international issues of the day is science intensive. And it's our role in the department to harness the contributions of South African science, scientific expertise to infuse those debates. For example, in the Paris agreement on climate change, we mobilize South African scientists to participate in the various advisory and consultative bodies. But I think it's also important to emphasize, and I know if my Minister Nzimande was listening, he would always remind us that, of course, what is science? Science is multidisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and we should not underestimate the actual crucial contribution our colleagues from the social sciences and humanities has to make to key diplomatic issues, including conflict resolution, including dealing with the challenges of the threats posed to multilateralism. And then in a new area, which is becoming very important for us, is to look at the scientific content of international trade relations. Whether those could be dealing with non-tariff trade, barriers to trade. We know that, for example, if we are going to successfully implement our vision of an Africa continental free trade area, that those efforts would have to be guided by science as we establish those relationships. But then perhaps just to conclude, and this is arguably for me often the most important dimension, and that is science for diplomacy. And you said it, Prof, science is universal language. Science doesn't know prejudice, science doesn't know discrimination. Science is about solidarity. And we're in this world where those values are under threat, where the values of what we in Africa believe of Ubuntu are under threat, we need science as a crucial role to play, more than ever, to bring people together, to bring countries together, to unite and not to divide. So we play an integral part as the Department of Science and Innovation, as part of the South African government's overall foreign policy effort. So, for example, where relations are new, where relations are complicated, science is often called upon to bring people together. It is an easy way, often, to connect countries who may not have much in common, who do not know each other. We saw, for example, in the strengthening of the South-South collaboration, as for example in the BRICS framework, that one of the first focus areas was to have scientific collaboration, because that brings people together, that brings institutions together, and we also believe, also drawing perhaps a leaf out of the example from our European friends, is as we seek to build this true African Union, this real African Union, where we need to connect people and we need to connect institutions, that as in Europe, science played a crucial role for integration. We believe science has a critical mission to play across the African continent to really bring our citizens together across national borders. And that's also our mission. That's why in the department, we have a dedicated focus on strengthening the partnerships and programs with the African Union and with our Southern African development community. So that in a nutshell is what it is all about. There cannot be, I think, a topic certainly I am more passionate about, but passionate about because it's about impact. And it's about anticipating exactly that future we want of a better South Africa. And as we like to say, in our policy statements, a better South Africa and a better Africa and a better world. So thank you again for this opportunity, and I very much look forward to be discussing with you and, of course, Prof Tulu, who I know well as one of Africa's leading young African science diplomats. Thank you, Prof.
Absolutely. You said it so well. I mean, and I hope people out there realize that what we're doing actually is also part of ensuring that science is an inclusive enterprise. We're trying to get African voices, young people in. And of course, it's wonderful to see Tolu on screen again. Tolu, it's so good to see you. Let me tell you people a little bit about you. Dan is correct, a young shining star of Africa, giving us a good name out there. Professor Tulula Oni is the director of the Global Diet and Physical Activity Group and Network at the University of Cambridge, MRC Epidemiology Unit, and an extraordinary professor and chair at Innovation Africa at UP, the University of Pretoria here in South Africa, where she leads the Urban Better Satellite Studio. She's the founder and principal of Urban Better and an honorary associate professor and lead in the research initiative for cities, health and equity, the Cities Health and Equity Group here at the University of Cape Town. A public health physician and urban epidemiologist, her work supports a coordinated approach between science, policy, and societal role players, identifying creative and long-term strategies to address complex urban health challenges in rapidly growing cities. She has served as scientific advisor for several organizations, including Future Earth and the International Science Council, and is an editorial board member of PLOS Global Public Health, Cities and Health, and the Journal of Urban Health. In recognition of her work, she has been profiled in the Lancet Journal, Science Magazine, and the British Medical Journal, and is a fellow of the African Academy of Sciences, a fellow of Next Einstein Forum, and a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. Tolu, can you please also introduce your perspective and share a little bit about your work and trajectory in science diplomacy and the needs and opportunities you see on the continent that science diplomacy actually can help address?
Really appreciate the invitation, and I looking forward to this discussion and really glad to see this happening. So you mentioned about me being in science diplomacy, and I think a lot of people resonate with this. It's an accidental journey. So I think maybe what I will start off with is giving a little bit of context to the ways that my work kind of pushed me in this in this direction, and then maybe just tease out some of the cross-cutting things that I've picked up along the way. So as you mentioned, I'm a public health physician scientist, and at the moment, I work at the interface of population health, urbanization, and climate change, but it didn't always start this way, and I've moved increasingly towards these more complex issues. And it's part because it's in part because I noticed that, so I initially was working on infectious diseases, and I noticed that there were some issues that were beyond the boundaries of the silo that I worked in. So I was working on HIV/TB in Khayelitsha in Cape Town, and I realized that, okay, in addition to this, in order for people to be fully well, and in order to not just treat a disease, but treat an entire person, you had to look at other risk factors that they were faced with. So I started looking at their non-communicable disease, because I started noticing that my patients with TB and HIV also had these other conditions that we were ignoring because it just added a level of complexity that we were not structured for. So they also had diabetes, obesity, etc. And I thought, well, we seem to be waiting for these things to occur. And you'll see where I'm going at the moment with the kind of broader context. A lot of things we seem to wait to occur, and then we devise systems to try and react to it. Now, those reactive systems are important, but there's a huge missed opportunity often in the prevention space to say, well, if a part of our emergencies are preventable, how can we ensure that as part of us thinking about tackling these complex societal issues, we're not just positioning ourselves to react to emergencies, but that we're actually anticipating and thinking about things that actually we could have seen coming, right? So I call them those preventable surprises, because that is not, for me, that is the true mark of resilience, right? If we can anticipate those preventable surprises. So I started looking at that interface. I started realizing that, okay, if people need to eat better, to be physically active, well, what is the space? We started noticing that the urban environment really shaped how people were able to embrace those health behaviors. But then I work in the health sector and I think, well, what could the healthcare sector do about the roads? And like, okay, I need to start talking to other people, right? So suddenly that shift of boundaries to say, okay, I need to start talking to the urban planners, right? Because that's where health is to some extent being shaped. And I noticed that some aspects of people's encounters relate to a climate risk that we face. So whether that's heat or air pollution. So I thought, okay, I need to start talking to the resilience people and the climate change people. And my training did not prepare me for this, right? My training, I'm a health professional, my training prepared me to diagnose disease. So I had to learn this approach to asking new questions, right? And understanding what the implications are for the governance of health and the landscape of actors that we need to be bringing to. I needed to equip myself with skills on how to seek common ground. Because if you go into a space and say, because this is my encounter, right? You go into a space and think, oh, health is the most important thing, right? You know, the hubris of the health sector sometimes. And people just look at you and think, do you think we're not doing anything here? So how do you actually seek common ground? How do you address competing interests, right? So if we're talking about public space, there's competing interest of need for housing, with a need for walkability, with a need for healthy air, with a need for energy security. There are all these competing interests that you need to actually address if you're going to have societal impact. How do we build capacity for collective action? So as I started doing that, I started realizing that this is beyond just the confines of science, and that's what got me into that kind of science diplomacy space. So particularly looking at the science in diplomacy and side of things, and also science for diplomacy. So how can we, in the context of these transboundary challenges, which I find myself, so I focus largely on the air we breathe, our places and spaces, and the food we eat, and how rapidly urbanizing spaces shape the health of people in those contexts, but also how the climate realities shape those environments and also shape health. So it becomes a really challenging issue. And one of the things I encountered was the importance of thinking about our risk perception. So I realized for a start that we cannot change what we cannot imagine, right? So often people, when we talk about the need for a healthier, more climate resilient futures, but when you delve into it's easier to see the problems around us. But if you say, can you actually imagine a future city that is climate resilient, that is healthy? That imagination is really critical to start to address those issues. And delving in, I ended up in that kind of, actually in the philosophy space, and I'm kind of reading in this space, and I'm like, God. But one of the things I came across was the notion of the counterfactual, right? Which is something you learn in epidemiology from a philosophy perspective. It's slightly different, and the counterfactual is just imagining a different reality. Right? And I realized that in order to effect change in the context of complexity, we have to be able to imagine that. And some of the key ingredients to do that, and I'm going to give you 3 ingredients with it, is that we have to be able to see cause and effect side by side. Right? Often when we can't see, okay, we do this and this happens, we find it difficult to imagine. We find it difficult or easier to imagine when it's impossible to continue business as usual. Right. So we saw that in the COVID pandemic. A lot of things that we were thought unimaginable, we couldn't possibly do. And then when business couldn't go as normal, we suddenly had to recreate and think and work across sectors, across silos. And lastly, when we cannot other the consequences of our actions. So we can't do something, we can't say, well, this is happening there with somebody else's responsibility. So the question I always ask, if I bring to a close, is the first question I always ask is, can we imagine if the COVID pandemic, right? So if the SARS-CoV-2 virus was as severe as it is in reality, but if in 2020 exposure to that virus in Cape Town resulted in disease not in Cape Town, or not just in Cape Town specifically, but in London. And if it did that 2 years later, so if the connection between cause and effect was separated in time and space, would we have acted so radically and so decisively? This is a challenge we face with things like climate change, right? We can other the consequences. We can't see the cause and effect side by side. We can go about our business as usual because we think we can't afford to act, but we don't see the cost of inaction. And so I've been shaping increasingly my science to look at how can we rethink, how can we reshape the ways that we ask questions, how can we reshape the scientific methods to be more collaborative, how can we bring in this diplomacy, because I see is so critical when we have to address complex transboundary issues. So you mentioned, Prof, you mentioned the air pollution. This is a really vital example, right? So I was traveling in a city recently, and I went to a really incredible, exclusive part of the city, and visually you could see, the streets were cleaner, everything was nicer, the trees, etc. But I was walking with an air quality monitor, and what was not different from everywhere else? The air quality, right? And so, but because we can't see it, because we don't see the impact of breathing poor air on a warming of the climate, on our children's health, on our own health, we think we can't afford to act, but we actually can't afford not to. And so I think it behooves the scientific enterprise, and we can come on to that, so I stop talking, but we have to think about the role of scientists and the role of scientific institutions to really ask these questions and think about whether our systems are fit for purpose, and challenging ourselves. I say to my team constantly, we have to be comfortable with discomfort, and we mustn't conflate uncertainty with ambiguity. We have to embrace uncertainty, because uncertainty is our reality, but that is not the same thing as ambiguity. And this is, I think, where science has a key role to play in diplomacy. We can clarify some of that ambiguity and bring rigorous approaches, but we have to embrace that complexity, and we have to embrace that discomfort and being in places where we don't belong, as it were, in order to seek that common ground, if we are to have science that is truly in service of the society of tomorrow and today, in fact.
Wow, great. Thank you so much, Tolu, for even the variety of questions that you are raising that are relevant for engaging within the space of science and diplomacy. When can we afford not to act as the world? When can we afford that? Are systems fit for purpose? Well, if COVID was not as urgent, would we have done things differently? And what would it have meant for the world? It's an interesting thing. I mean, it made me think about what are we doing for HIV/AIDS, for TB? Is it because it's not as urgent that, that we can afford to be slow? But very interesting questions that I think science and diplomacy colleagues have to engage in. So it's really, really key work that you're doing. Danny, but before I call Danny, I want to invite people who are online. There are people who are joining us on Teams. There are people who are joining us on Facebook and on Twitter. Please write your questions in the comment line, and we'll pick them up and ask our two experts to engage with them. But in the meantime, Danny, I want to ask you this. I mean, you are one of the key thought leaders on this topic in Africa, and you are an architect of many key efforts, mostly recently in South Africa, the South Africa Science Diplomacy Initiative. I want you to tell us a little bit about it and about the process of establishing this important milestone. Any lessons learned that you can share with other African countries willing to establish their national science diplomacy strategies? I think that might be useful at this point. Over to you, Dan.
The recently established initiative, which we call the Science Diplomacy Capital for Africa, it's in the first instance based on a principle which has been very important for us in South African science throughout our democracy, and that is that we seek to exploit what we call our comparative geographic advantages, because we cannot, no country can invest in every area. So you have to invest in areas where you have a comparative advantage. So for example, South Africa invests in the marine sciences because we have access to the Atlantic, the ocean, southern sciences. We invest in biodiversity. In Cape Town, you know all about the rich biodiversity. Or, for example, one of the reasons we is a major investor in astronomy is because of the access, unique observing conditions we have in South Africa. But one thing we have as well is that we have Africa's largest diplomatic community. There are no other African country where there are more different embassies, consul generals represented. South Africa also hosts the regional headquarters of various global and continental and regional bodies. And of course, we also play host to many of our continent's leading research universities, scientific institutions such as our Council for Scientific Industrial Research, etc. So very much inspired, I should say, by GESDA, we thought, how do we bring this community together? Let's create a platform, and that was for 3 objectives. In the first instance, let's just get diplomats and the scientists to talk, to know each other better. Because as Tolu and others have spoken, there's much we can do together and learn from each other. So that's what the initiative seeks to do in the first instance. And then in the second instance, we've spoken about all the global challenges today, pandemic, disease, etc. But arguably, if not unarguably, the most critical challenge facing us is the persistent inequality and the poverty, which is a blemish on our world. Obviously in South Africa, in Africa, but across the world. So we want to really harness this partnership between the diplomatic community and the scientific community to not only alleviate poverty, but defeat poverty, and really focus our attention on that. And then in the third instance, we wanted to make sure, as science diplomacy is for some, it's become a buzzword, and we always should be very careful about buzzwords, because then we speak without necessarily thinking about what they are. But it's a rising theme, it's an emerging theme in different international forums and platforms, and we wanted to make sure that South Africa, but also Africa, has a seat at that table with a dedicated initiative. Certainly, in terms of partnership with other African countries, we very much see this as a partnership which is open to involvement with Pan-African bodies. For example, the African Academy of Sciences, of which Prof Tolu as a member is an integral part. We'll be working very closely with the African Union's Development Agency. But advice, I would share with my sisters and brothers and fellow African ministries is, in the first instance, always shape an initiative which makes sense for you. Contextualize it in your own context, and very much understand what your specific national drivers are, and then start with the obvious, and that's just the connecting the diplomatic and scientific communities, because we sometimes like to think we live in an ubiquitous information society and information accessible and everyone knows everyone. It doesn't work like that, and there are still many walls to be broken down, silos to be broken down by bringing the diplomatic and scientific communities closer together. And we believe, not only South Africa, but across our continent, there's excellence, there's the science with impact, science with relevance, which should be harnessed to advance our agenda. Thanks, Prof. Thanks, Dan.
Tolu, I think that question about Africa is very, very important. Because science can be in aid of diplomacy. Here's a question from Lawrence Norris. And he says, how do individual science diplomats and NGOs navigate the byways of science policy in Africa? There are so many possible touches. Science ministries, health ministries, higher education ministries, etc., etc. It's everywhere. Where and how can we tie it all together? Is that even possible? Like, where, when you play that, but how do you, from where you're sitting, I know that you are not in a government, where you're sitting, how do you see that happening?
That's a really excellent question. And I think there's an attitudinal response required, which is that often or sometimes where you think is the lever of entry may not be where you anticipate. So there is some adaptability required. And the second aspect is understanding the landscape. So I thought, for example, when I was starting in this space, I thought I knew because I was kind of very embedded in place in Cape Town, I thought I had a good sense of it. And I realized that actually what I was most familiar with was the health sector and the health policy. And because we have a bias towards deficit, when we don't know, sometimes we say things like, oh, people should do this, there should be this. And you have to ask yourself, are you sure that isn't already happening, right? Whether or not it's happening as effectively as it should, but it's really important to understand what is actually happening on the ground. As an entry point, because it's quite alienating to confront somebody who has been working very hard in a space and say, oh, what's not happening? And I said, oh, I've been working the last 20 years on this. Educate yourself before you come speak to me. And sometimes as scientists, we don't do our due diligence in that regard. So if I give you an example, years ago, when I was just setting up that research group in Cape Town, I wanted to do this kind of work, right? And I actually wanted to bring health and education together. That was my focus. But I thought I was trying to get to them, so I thought I'll organize a workshop and bring different government sectors together, and health and education, and lots of different sectors. But I had a plan in mind. I knew what I was going for, right? Because I wanted to do something with health in schools, and that was my mission. And then actually in one of the coffee breaks, somebody from Human Settlements came to me and said, we know housing matters for health. And in fact, we're actually writing this strategic framework document at the moment. And it's not really, we know it matters, but it's not really our priority and it's not our mandate, right, to focus on that. But we're really interested. And I suddenly was like, oh, okay, pivot, because there was an entry point there. And if I had said, okay, can I come back to you in a few years? I want to focus on education, but I would have missed an opportunity. So sometimes it's understanding the landscape, right? Because there is not one approach. We need lots of people doing these different things. But for me, it was a combination of that serendipity, of that conversation. We connected. We had a sense of shared purpose, and it started a 5-year, still ongoing partnership on looking at integrating health into human settlements policy. And that all came about, and that entry point was an entry point then from not just human settlements, but also climate and resilience and urban planning and the rest of that. So there was this entry point approach. So I think my answer to that would be kind of knowing the landscape and really engaging with, not assuming that nothing is being done, because I've been overwhelmed by really how incredible action is on the ground, because the challenges are real, right? And this is the privilege of academia that we don't sufficiently exercise. We have the time and space to convene, to make connections, because nobody's voting for us to deliver on services, right? We have it's a privilege to take a step back and to make those connections and to generate evidence that can actually be in support of the implementers. And we have to constantly ask ourselves, well, because my experience has been that actually the scientific enterprise and the scientific institutions are not necessarily sufficiently supportive of scientists wanting to activate that privilege. And I think as our scientific institutions, we have to say, well, if we want our scientists to engage in this way, what are the ways what are our incentive structures? What do we prioritize in terms of skill sets that give them the skills to navigate these spaces in a way that is truly useful for people that are actually implementing on the ground? So that's a very long-winded answer. I hope that helps.
Very helpful, very helpful. I'm glad I started with you on this one, but I want to go to Danny, and Dan will reflect a little bit on that. But actually, Lawrence elaborated more on his question and asked a follow-up question. So, as you sort of just briefly touch on the question that I asked Tolu, Dan, Lawrence is also asking, what are the roles of multilateralism in science, diplomacy, and policy in Africa? And to what extent is policy affected by what is done at the various RECs and the African Union?
I think, first of all, to say what we often speak about open science and the values of open science, or how that is important for the advancement of the scientific enterprise. And for the advancement of diplomacy, we should apply and practice those same values. So diplomacy itself should become a more inclusive enterprise. There's a stereotype image diplomacy negotiations, sometimes behind dark rooms, behind closed doors. So the whole negotiation process, the whole engagement process should become more inclusive with an active participant from the NGOs and other bodies which Prof Norris referred to. When it comes to the role of multilateralism and the role of science in strengthening the various decisions and programs of the African Union, clearly the ambition is there, but we should also be frank. And I mean, this is not a webinar this afternoon, Prof, for us to hide behind diplomatic speak. I can do that. As a diplomat, you are learned sometimes to say nothing and a lot of things at the same time. But it's work in progress. There are many challenges, and we have to collectively work as African governments, as an African science community, to enhance the impact we achieve and in our African Union bodies with regard to science. Often there are challenges of resource constraints. We know that. But this is, I think, where we really need almost like an activist approach, also from our scientific community, to challenge us in governments. You should be asking, why is there not more money for Pan-African science when governments and institutions may be investing in other areas? Because again, if we are brutally honest, and we have to be honest with ourselves, there's sometimes a disconnect between some of the objectives, the rhetoric about science advice for policy, science diplomacy, and what's happening in practice. And I think we count on the youth, we count on the next generation of scientists you've mobilized this afternoon in anticipating that future to help us shape that future, and including to be activist scientists and activist diplomats.
Martin Hall is asking a question, and I want to start with you, Dan. I mean, this is about climate change, and he's saying we can see the failure to address climate change as a global challenge, as a casebook study of the failure of conventional diplomacy. How do you think that diplomacy can be reinvented to address the complex health challenges that Tolu has spoken about, or that you have identified at a local level, so that the urgency and danger of global warming has meaning within communities, giving them agency over their own lives?
I think it's an excellent example of the challenges we confront us, and indeed it's a legitimate question. Are we going to, and I think we collectively on this call should be asking those questions for ourselves, certainly us in government, are we really going to be learning the lessons we learned during COVID-19 about international cooperation to respond to climate change and other health challenges, or are we going to fall into the trap of going back to where things have been before, retreating behind walls? I will never forget my former minister, reference Minister Nzimani, Minister Naledi Pandor, who of course is a formidable champion for science diplomacy. During the time of the Ebola crisis, I was in her office, and she said, we can never again be in a situation where Africa has to be dependent on support and medical resources from elsewhere without having our own capacity. So we need to invest and we need to develop that. Of course, COVID-19 arrived. We are now, including in Cape Town, for example, through the work of the first MNRA Technology Transfer Hub, making sure we put in place those initiatives that we are enabled to respond to them in future. But we have to be cognizant of the lessons we've learned. Now, what Martin is also asking is that when we speak about global climate change, this cannot be abstract. That's why the point I made earlier about it being an inclusive. Local communities have to have their say. They're at the forefront. They often bear the brunt of the impact of climate change. So how do we ensure that those voices are heard, including in the global negotiations where representatives speak on their behalf? So it's making, in my view, diplomacy as well more inclusive, more participatory, and being more sensitive, really to the agendas we seek to advance. But I think, as Martin, he's really sketched a problem statement there, which is a problem statement for all of us, those in science and those in diplomacy.
And Danny, do you think, Tolu, I'm going to ask you to engage with that question just now, Martin asked. I just want, before I move to you, to ask Danny whether, this is Kaya Sishwo's asking, do you think that science diplomacy can have a role in bringing the two parties, Russia and Ukraine, together?
Scientists know each other. As I've said earlier, they can speak to each other, because science is about discovering what's universal and then responding to those challenges which we share. And whether it's in the Russia-Ukraine or other situations, I believe that science, the values of science, the collaborative nature of science can play a role to bring parties together. And we have examples. We have example in the Middle East, for example, where there's the Sesame synchrotron, which brings together countries, scientists from countries which normally would be at political odds and tension for each other. So I think it's very important that we hope and harness the potential of science to respond to conflict situations, whether those are in Eastern Europe or elsewhere in the world.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because some universities said we don't collaborate with Russian universities anymore, and Russian Vice-Chancellor said we support the war. So it makes it very tricky. But maybe science can bring them together. Tolu, do you want to talk to us about how whether diplomacy can be reinvented to address the complex challenges you talked about?
Yeah, no, I think it's a great question, Martin, the case of reinventing diplomacy, but also reinventing science and reinventing citizenry, right? What it means to be an active citizen. At the start of the pandemic, 2020, I was reflecting on a couple of experiences, which I'll tell you about now, and it resulted in writing an opinion piece on the need for a Marshall Plan for planetary health in Africa, right? Mm-hmm. There's two reflections from that. One is I wrote something about, we're talking about universal health coverage in Africa, etc. And I wrote something about how we need to be thinking about prevention and thinking ahead in an academic journal, and got a peer review response, honestly, almost verbatim, that said, Africa can't afford to think long term at the moment. So park that to one side. And then on another side, I was speaking to a multilateral financing agency that funds quite big infrastructure projects across the continent. And I said, well, what are you doing for health and how are you promoting health? And they talked about the kind of healthcare in hospitals and clinics. And I provocatively said, well, so is the rest of your funding then funding projects that fill those hospitals and clinics? Because if you don't think about health in those spaces, that's what you're doing. If you're funding roads that are increasing air pollution, that make people can't walk, then you're actually filling those hospitals. And we have to think differently. And the reason those led to kind of thinking about a Marshall Plan for planetary health is that we have to center where we want to go in our metrics of as opposed to setting up a separate thing. I'm a little bit skeptical about separate green funds for things, because using that example of health, I think, well, are the other funds brown? Because then you need increasingly greener funds, bigger greener funds. We have to think about integrated approaches to complexity. So when I set up Urban Better in 2020, it was around three things, which it's a helpful mnemonic for me, and I hope it is for you. It's around the need to aspire, inspire, and conspire when we're tackling these issues. So aspire is thinking about where we actually want to go, right? And thinking about whether our systems are aligned in that way. So are we committing urban infrastructure projects for health? Are we actually demanding that new roads think about walkability? Are we demanding that new houses think about ventilation? Or are we just thinking about healthcare and treating TB from houses that don't have poor ventilation? So how do we actually aspire for what we want to do, right? And that needs commitments and shaping new norms and raising awareness about those connections. Inspire is really critical, and this is the role of citizen scientists, science. We have 70% of people under the age of 30 on this continent. I mean, that is everyone. When we talk about it's everyone, right? So when we're talking about the importance of leveraging participatory citizen science approaches to harness this hope and to help us identify early threats, to inform. Dan, you talked about activism. I talk about evidence-informed activism, right? How can we actually think about science in service of activism? How can we use those data to support the next generation? And conspire, lastly, is because we recognize that these things can't be done in isolation. That's why these kind of initiatives that you've got here, Prof, is so critical. We need to aspire and inspire, but we need to connect with communities of like-minded. We need to learn from each other. We're missing an opportunity that I think we don't do sufficient learning across the continent. And I traverse different parts, different countries across the continent. I see the same issues, and I would bring people together and think, oh, I didn't realize this was happening. We could have told you this. And so we need to kind of conspire more together. And so I think tackling Martin's question, I think those three mnemonics might be helpful for us to think about, and that's why we have. If I give you an example of our Citizens for Clean Air, I want to talk about that very quickly. We've run out of time, but we had young people yesterday in Cape Town running across 8 different routes across Cape Town with air quality monitors, with the citizen science app capturing aspects of the built environment that influence health and climate risks. So they're generating data from across the city that they're going to use to devise activism messages for COP27. This is the kind of thing that we need to start doing more of. This is science, this is active citizenry, and this is the future of science diplomacy. I think it's participatory. Yeah, thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you so much for touching that aspect of inspiring the youth, getting them involved and doing things that get them excited, because we need their voices in there. So thank you very much. I know that it's 1 minute past 5, but I want us to go just a few minutes, because I want Dani to tell us about the conference that South Africa is hosting in December. I think it's important to do that, and then I'll then go on to close. But Dani, we'll be having this. We are hosting this conference in December here in Cape Town for the first time in Africa, the World Science Forum. Can you tell us about it, and also how it will help elevate science diplomacy in and for the African continent?
Exactly.
It's here and it's happening in Cape Town. Will it do that, and how will it do that?
Excellent. Thank you very much. So South Africa indeed will be hosting for the first time in Africa the World Science Forum from the 6th to the 9th of December in Cape Town. The World Science Forum is one of the leading global platforms for a discussion on the role of science in society. It's been organized over the past 24 years under the umbrella of UNESCO, with various international organizations such as the International Science Council, the Inter-Academic Panel, and others, which we're supporting that. So what it is, first of all, it's not a governmental conference. It's not an intergovernmental conference. It's not for boring bureaucrats like me. I deliberately this afternoon didn't wear a tie because I didn't want to come across as a stereotype diplomat, because diplomats shouldn't only be men in suits. It's also not only a scientific conference. It's not only a conference where the scientists speak amongst themselves. It's really a conference, a platform for open and critical and frank discussions between everyone who cares about the role science should play in our society and how we can enhance the role science response to societal challenges. And of course, science diplomacy is a key component of that. Our government has decided, in consultation with UNESCO, that the theme will be science for social justice. Of course, social justice, the fight for social justice, a critical priority, a theme for all of South Africans, but we believe it's a theme which needs to be discussed at a global level. And what does it mean at a global level? It's science for environmental justice. It is making sure that in using new disruptive technology, such as artificial intelligence, big data, we do not increase through inappropriate ethical and regulatory guidelines the impact of those the technologies, which could be unjust. It's going to look at making sure that the scientific enterprise itself reflects the values of justice, speaking to questions of inclusivity, ethics, integrity, and then very important, and this is why we wanted to bring this forum to Cape Town, is to ensure that African science is put at the forefront and that African voices are heard in shaping this very important global debate, because we believe that this is also a contribution that we want. As a world, as a global community, we are not going to decisively respond to any of the challenges we spoke about this afternoon without ensuring that Africa is giving its rightful place to contribute to those. So this is an open invitation to everyone on this call. You'll easily find the website reference. It's an event which is open. It's an event which is going to be inclusive, and we certainly look forward to see everyone there and engage in what we are confident will be a relevant, a pertinent, and a very vibrant debate. Thank you for allowing me to mention that, Prof.
Thanks, Dan. I mean, it's very important in my view. This is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity for us in our generation, for us, for Africans to get involved. And you've invited everyone. It's not just for diplomats. It's not just for the scientists. And I'm thinking there's so many people on this continent who participate in research projects, clinical trials, and so on and so forth. Maybe some of them are listening. Maybe some of them, their children tell them. and if they wanted to participate, is there a plan to get people from the grounds, from Mombasa, as much as we get people from Guguletu, is there a plan to get those people who, some of who participate, but they don't know where their work go, their contributions go, what they,
No, most definitely. First of all, I say, of course, there's obviously a limit on the physical participation because a venue can only take so many people. But every session, every discussion will be free online. There are no registration fees. They will all be broadcast live. But we are working very closely with different bodies. First of all, with bodies such as the South African Young Academy of Science or the Global Young Academy, to ensure that, and we'll be very strict. That in every single session, we want the voices of young scientists to be heard. We want African voices to be heard, and we want the gender parity to be completely respected in all our sessions. But also, to go back to what I said earlier, it's not only for government officials or scientists, that when we speak about climate justice, for example, we want climate activists to be in the room. When we speak about science responding to unemployment, we want the voices of young African science entrepreneurs who are struggling to be in there, speaking on the platforms, to say to us as government, you have these ambitions, these plans, but they're not working. They're not corresponding to our reality. So we are working very closely with various civil societies, various continental and regional bodies to make sure that we have that inclusive participation with a very strong African footprint from across our continent. What we're also doing is we'll be bringing African science journalists to the forum to ensure that, and not only those from the Anglophone world, but from the French-speaking world, from North Africa, to ensure that the messages, the debates which will be discussed in Cape Town resonate across our continent. But again, everyone listening, my Twitter handle has been shown earlier at Dan de Tooy. If you have any suggestions, any proposals, please reach out to me. We look forward to hear from you. And certainly, Prof, we're also going to be in touch with you and UCT about making you an active partner in this event.
Fantastic. I'll be there. I'm already with my partners planning to present something. So, Tolu, are you coming with the Clean Air Initiative with the young African youth people that you're working with all over the continent?
Yes, we would love to. So we're working with that's Citizens for Clean Air, so City with a Y. Yeah. It's in Cape Town, it's in Lagos and Accra, right? So we're actually going to be taking some of them to Egypt for COP27, and we would love to have them involved in the World Science Forum as well, because we've also been working with them in terms of the advocacy skills and tactics that will be evidence-based, and so it'd be great to have them involved. I would definitely love to do that. So Dan will definitely follow up with you afterwards. Perfect. It's incredible. People are really excited to be, yesterday on the run, people were like, yeah, it's coming through scientists, we're collecting information, they were really, really engaged. So we need to harness this more systemically.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dan and Tolu. Thank you so much, as always. You came to the party and you've delivered. We're getting very good comments on our social media pages. We really, really appreciate you making the time to engage with us in this way. Thank you for the work that you do. I want to thank our audience, particularly young people who have been engaging with us throughout the sessions. And I encourage you, young people, participate in the challenge that we've put out there. And note that if you haven't had the time to listen or watch all the 4 sessions, they will be available on the UCT YouTube channels. They'll be available within the next few days. In fact, the last 3 are already there. You just have to go there and watch them. And the one that we're recording today will be available in a few days. So I encourage you to watch them. If you have missed any, go there, invite your friends. Let's get involved. Let's not wait until things happen and then complain about Africa being excluded. Young people, let's get included. Let's participate now. Thank you so much for joining me. It's been a fantastic 4-week series. I hope to see some of you in your submissions. And then, of course, I'm looking forward to see who goes to Geneva. I'll see you there. Have a good evening.